It is the 24th of September 1967. The city of Enugu is under siege with continual bombardment from Nigerian soldiers. It appears that the Nigerian Civil War will soon be over. 4 men have been tried by the Court of Justice in Biafra, and they have been sentenced to death for allegedly trying to overthrow the government of Colonel Emeka Ojukwu. The 4 of them are marched out for the firing squad, and the executioner calls out, "Fire!" The soldiers aim at all 4 men. After the first round of shooting, 3 of the men are dead, but 1 man is still alive. This man calls out defiantly to his executioners, "I am not dead yet." The leader of the executioners gives a signal for another round of shooting. It takes 3 rounds of brutal aiming at this man's body to silence his protest. The man's name is Victor Banjo. These documentaries by textandpublishing.com are aimed at telling the Nigerian story to an audience that will be better informed about our past and help make our nation great in the future. Share and like our videos, subscribe to our channel, and kindly leave a comment for us in the comment section. Ensure you conclude watching the video. Thank you very much for watching. The man known to Nigerian history as Victor Banjo was born on the 1st of April 1930 in the town of Ijebu-Ode in southwest Nigeria. His full name at birth was Victor Adebukunla Banjo. Victor's father was J.H. Banjo. J.H. Banjo descended from a family of Ijebu warriors who had resisted the British incursion into their homeland in the 19th century. J.H. Banjo had the opportunity to acquire Western education through the missionary activities of Europeans that were replete in the Ijebu area of Nigeria in those days. J.H. Banjo was educated at St. Andrew's College in Oyo Town, where he obtained a teacher's certification. That school was the highest institution of learning in those days. He wished he could further his education and go on to become a lawyer, but he never did fulfill this ambition. He had hoped that his son Victor would follow the legal line and become a lawyer instead. J.H. Banjo's father was Pa Odubanjo, who established his home at 42 Awujale Street, Oduegbo in Ijebu-Ode. It was in this house that Victor Banjo was born. J.H. Banjo, Victor's father, decided to change the family name from Odubanjo to simply Banjo after he became a Christian. He felt the Odu pointed too much to his ancestral pagan roots. Victor Banjo's mother was Chief Mrs. Sabina Maun Banjo. She was born in Omo in present-day Ogun State. She also had been exposed to Western education early in life and had graduated from a CMS-run seminary for girls. Her father was Pa David Otenaike. He was a farmer who had raised his family from the products that he obtained from a very large farmstead. Victor Banjo's mother had 11 children, but only 7 of these children survived to adulthood. Victor Banjo was her 3rd surviving child. Victor Banjo was born in colonial Nigeria, where the British were endeavoring to establish a modern government in the country. J.H. Banjo, his father, initially took up employment as a teacher with the CMS Grammar School in Lagos. His career as a teacher also opened up opportunity for him to go into the ministry and become an Anglican priest. Unfortunately, J.H. Banjo often found himself at loggerheads with the management of the missions. When they could no longer handle his criticism of them any longer, they posted him to a mission in Benin City. J.H. Banjo was unhappy with this arrangement, and it led to his resigning his work and joining the Nigerian Civil Service as a clerk. The white men found him very useful because of his sound command of the English language and his ability to organize men around him. The British therefore employed him to move all around Nigeria to establish new outposts for the colonial government. J.H. Banjo was eventually posted to Abeokuta, where he retired from the colonial government in 1953. At this time, he had acquired some knowledge in law, and he then applied for the post of a customary judge in a magistrate court. He got the job and was in this role until 1965, when the Western Region political crisis commenced. J.H. Banjo was a committed NCNC member, while his wife, Victor's mother, had sympathies for the action group. His political allegiance would eventually lead to his removal as magistrate judge during the crisis. Victor Banjo attended the Victoria Government School for his primary education. Victor's father was opening up a colonial outpost in Victoria in present-day Cameroon around this time, and so the children attended the government school in that area. They were in Victoria, Cameroon from 1932 to 1939. Victor had to move with his parents to Makurdi in present-day Benue State, where his father had been transferred. He concluded his primary education in Makurdi and was then sent to Lagos to commence his secondary school education at CMS Grammar School in 1944. Banjo graduated from that school with a grade 1, and he had A's in all the 9 subjects he took in the Cambridge School Certification Examination in that year, 1949. That same year, Banjo was invited to Egbado College to teach science subjects to the senior students there. He was in this school from 1949 to 1951. Banjo had ambition to obtain a university degree. He had tried to gain admission to the University College, now University of Ibadan, in 1951, but he failed the examination. When he took the examination again in 1952, he was one of the highest scorers. Unfortunately, there was a case of examination leakage that year, and the students were invited to retake the exams. Banjo declined the offer and instead opted to join the Nigerian Army. As a 5-year-old, Victor Banjo had been enthralled by the sight of soldiers marching during the Empire Day's March. At one occasion, he broke away from the grip of his mother and joined the soldiers to march, before his obviously embarrassed mother quickly withdrew him from the men marching. This fascination with the army would very likely have again been aroused in him following his disappointment with being admitted to the University College. Victor Banjo only informed his parents that he had joined the army after the whole process had been completed. His parents were not happy with this decision. His father had wished that he would pursue a career in law. His mother had a strong foreboding about his venture into the army, but Banjo's mind was already made up even at that time. Nigeria of the late 1940s and the early 1950s was a country that was experiencing a rise in political awareness among young Nigerians. The McPherson Constitution had been inaugurated for the country in 1951, and it had allowed a lot more opportunity for indigenous people to run for political office. It was clear to many thinking Nigerians that with time, the white man would allow indigenous people to take complete control of the government of their country. In fact, the talk of self-rule had become a major sing-song by pro-nationalist groups like the NCNC and the Nigerian Youth Movement. In 1951, Obafemi Awolowo and others inaugurated the Action Group, and that political group became a competing political option to the NCNC, which up till this time was the leading political group in the southern parts of Nigeria, following the dwindling influence of the Nigerian Youth Movement. In 1952, the Action Group commenced government in southwest Nigeria, with Obafemi Awolowo leading the government there. Similarly, the NCNC held power in the southeast of the country, with Nnamdi Azikiwe leading government there, while the Northern People's Congress led government in northern Nigeria, with Ahmadu Bello as leader of government in that place. It was within this political climate that Victor Banjo joined the Nigerian Army. Even within the Banjo family, his father had sympathies for the NCNC, while his mother was a supporter of the Action Group. The Banjo family could be regarded as being politically liberal. Victor Banjo joined the Royal West African Frontier Force in November 1953 as a cadet officer. His number was WA-52. The Royal West African Frontier Force became the Nigerian Army on the 1st of October 1956. Banjo was sent to the regular officer school at Teshi, Ghana for a 6-month training course. When he returned, he underwent a screening exercise with the West African Command Board. Only 3 individuals survived that rigorous screening process. They were Victor Banjo, David Ejo, and Adekunle Fajuyi. The 3 of them were commissioned officers of the Nigerian Army with numbers NA-16, NA-17, and NA-18 respectively. Yakubu Gowon was NA-149, while Emeka Ojukwu was NA-185. This shows clearly that Victor Banjo had long been commissioned an officer before these 2, even though they occupied the same rank in 1966 at the time the first coup occurred in Nigeria. The army quickly discovered that Victor Banjo was a man of superior intellect, and they saw that he could occupy some vital roles in the army to aid the army's quick development and functioning. In 1954, Victor Banjo and David Ejo were sent to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in England for further training. At this time, Banjo had sat for the London GCE A-level examination and had passed. He was therefore eligible to run a degree program at a university abroad. The army felt this was an opportunity to boost its ranks, and so Banjo became the first Nigerian military officer to be sponsored on full scholarship to read mechanical engineering in the United Kingdom between 1958 and 1961. While studying at Sandhurst, Banjo met Joyce Taiwo George, a Sierra Leonean lady, and married her. The year was 1956. That same year, the Banjos returned to Nigeria, where the family helped to organize a church wedding for them at the Chapel of the Resurrection, University of Ibadan. All the top military brass were present at the wedding, including Nigeria's future head of state, Yakubu Gowon. Between 1957 and 1958, Banjo was posted to the Mechanized Division of the Nigerian Army in Ibadan. There he made it his duty to ensure that army drivers were the most polite and well-behaved on the road. He even took his campaign for good driving to civilian drivers on the road. So much so that in the late 1950s, traffic in Ibadan was some of the most organized in the whole country. In 1958, Victor Banjo was promoted to the rank of captain after he had passed a rigorous examination. That same year, the army sponsored him to the United Kingdom to obtain a degree in mechanical engineering. Nigeria was nearing independence, and it was clear that an indigenous officer would be needed to head the mechanical and electrical department of the Nigerian Army. Victor Banjo was quickly touted as the person to fill this position. At this period, the couple were having challenges with childbearing. It appeared that every time Joyce became pregnant, it was almost always followed by a miscarriage. Finally, on the 5th of May 1959, the Banjos were blessed with the gift of a bouncing baby boy. Sadly, the baby died soon after birth. Joyce was very sad, but to comfort her, Victor Banjo bought a very expensive dress for her. It was a satin and silk dress that was covered with sequins. That dress will inspire the name of a book written by Victor Banjo but published by his daughter, Professor Olayinka Omigbodun, in 2008. 11 months after the loss of that child, their first surviving child was born in April 1960 in the United Kingdom. They named her Olufunto. Their second child, a boy, was born exactly a year after. They named him Dele. The first 2 children were born in the United Kingdom. On the 11th of February 1963, Olayinka was born. Deyemi was born in 1965, exactly 6 months before the upheaval of January 15, 1966 happened. The last 2 children were born at the University College Hospital, Ibadan. Victor Banjo and his wife Joyce had quickly put behind them the trouble they were having with keeping a pregnancy, having been blessed with 4 children in a space of 5 years. When Victor Banjo returned from the United Kingdom in 1961 with a degree in mechanical engineering, he was promoted to the rank of a major. In 1963, Banjo was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he was appointed the commanding officer of the division of the Nigerian Army in Apapa, Lagos. It became clear to the army that she needed to begin to build her own machinery, and with many of the expatriate military officers leaving Nigeria following the country's independence from Britain, Victor Banjo was appointed the first indigenous director of the Nigerian Electrical and Mechanical Engineering Corps of the Nigerian Army in 1965. He was in this role when the January 1966 coup occurred. While Banjo's career was progressing in the Nigerian army, there was increasing upheaval in the political climate in Nigeria. The disagreement between Obafemi Awolowo and his erstwhile deputy in the action group had spilled over into the overall politics of the country. Awolowo had been jailed in September 1963. In 1964, the federal elections were greatly disputed. Nnamdi Azikiwe, as the Governor General of the country, had refused to call Tafawa Balewa to form a government. While the disputation continued, a question was brought to a meeting of Nigerian Army officers by Major General Everald, an expatriate Army officer still serving in Nigeria after independence. Everald wanted to know what the military officers would do if the question arose as to whom the army should obey: Nnamdi Azikiwe, the constitutional head of government in the country, or Tafawa Balewa, the nation's prime minister. Banjo and a few others believed that Zik was to be obeyed. The discussions did not stop in this meeting. During the political deadlock between Zik and Balewa, Victor Banjo and Colonel Emeka Ojukwu met up with a few other officers in the military, asking them to support a potential takeover of government from the politicians. Zik was contacted on this plan, and he had actually given his blessing to it. Banjo was to lead a detachment of soldiers from the Apapa Infantry Division to ensure a successful transition of government. Banjo was by the phone awaiting orders from his superior, Samuel Ademulegun, for the soldiers to be rolled out, when suddenly they heard in the news that Azikiwe had agreed to call Balewa to form a government. Victor Banjo was thoroughly disappointed. He spent the whole night calling soldiers on the phone and instructing them to stand down, stating that with the latest development, all plans had changed. Unfortunately for him, news had gone round the army about Banjo's involvement in that push, and he was being branded a mutinous soldier. Victor Banjo made up his mind to have very little to do with Nigerian politicians from that time henceforth. In fact, the thought of leaving the army began to run through his mind at that time. One of the assignments that had been given to him when he became head of the Electrical and Mechanical Corps was to build Nigeria's first ordnance factory. This required that he traveled a great deal out of Nigeria, and in the process, the idea of forming an engineering company was registered in his mind. Banjo then created Union Engineering. He employed an Italian to man the operations and also had one other staff, a lady. He planned to use the company to win contracts around Nigeria and then build a formidable engineering outfit that he hoped he could retire into and then head as chief executive after his career in the army was over. On the night of 14 January 1966, Victor Banjo had gone to see Lieutenant Colonel Emeka Ojukwu at a guest house in Lagos, where he was staying to talk business with him. Banjo was a very good friend of Ojukwu and was hoping to get some connection to Ojukwu's wealthy father's patronage for business. Banjo left Ojukwu that night and headed home to be with his family. From his testimony later, Victor Banjo said that he learned of the Saturday, January 15 coup from Yakubu Gowon. Gowon himself had been earmarked for elimination, but because he changed the room he was supposed to sleep in at the hotel, when the mutinous soldiers arrived there, they did not find him. That Saturday, 15 January 1966, there was a lot of uncertainty in the air. No one knew who was a mutinous soldier and who was not. Ironsi had ordered troops out to quell the rebellion, but even he was in hiding and none of his officers could locate him. Banjo gathered a number of senior officers to his office at the Electrical and Mechanical Corps and tried to explain as best as he could what might be going on. He himself was not sure of what exactly was happening. He spent the whole day helping his colleagues to understand that this was a revolution of some sort from junior officers, and he was also endeavoring to pacify senior northern officers who felt aggrieved that many of their own had been killed. Ironsi, Ogundipe, and a host of other senior officers were nowhere to be found. By the following morning, the 16th of January, word had gotten out that Ironsi was hiding out at the police headquarters at Obalende, Lagos. Banjo led a team of senior officers to Ironsi, and immediately a meeting of high-ranking officers of the Nigerian military was called. Deliberations began on what exactly should be done to salvage the matter. The Prime Minister of the country was still missing. Reports had reached them that the Premier of Northern Nigeria, Ahmadu Bello, had been killed, as well as the Premier of the Western region, Ladoke Akintola. Banjo advised his colleagues that rather than allow the country to continue aimlessly, a federal military government should be formed and that Ironsi should be made to lead that government. Banjo also suggested that military officers should be sent to the 4 regions of the country to hold forth there. This was the first time ever in Nigerian history that a military government would be created, and the whole idea of having a military head of state and even governors all emanated from Banjo's suggestions. Emeka Ojukwu was appointed military governor of the Eastern region in that meeting. David Ejo was sent to the Midwest region. Victor Banjo was appointed governor of the Western region, and Major Hassan Katsina was appointed the head of the Northern region that day, the Sunday of the 16th of January 1966. Banjo declined the offer to lead the government of the Western region. He felt that he needed to be close to Ironsi to help offer the nascent military government direction. So, Adekunle Fajuyi was asked to go to the Western region in Ibadan instead. Victor Banjo was then given the assignment of drafting out a document which the remaining surviving members of the Balewa government will sign, and that will allow for the military government to assume duty over the country legally. All this was done on Sunday the 16th January 1966. Victor Banjo was actually being touted to become the chief of staff to Ironsi until everything changed by Monday morning the following day, the 17th of January 1966. It should be noted that while Ironsi was receiving the reins of government from the civilians in Lagos, the mutinous soldiers in Kaduna, led by Major Kaduna Nzegu, had given some conditions that would make it possible for them to work with Ironsi. One of these conditions was that they wanted Victor Banjo to lead the military government. They did not trust Ironsi. Banjo had replied to those men that he could not lead such a government. He told them that there is a hierarchy in the army and he cannot undermine his superiors. Having been known as a mutinous soldier from way back in 1964 and now having Nzegu touting him to lead the military government, all eyes were now beginning to turn on him, and not a few people began to suspect that he could have had a hand in the coup. Victor Banjo left his house on the morning of the 17th of January 1966, and he never returned there again. He headed immediately to see the Supreme Commander, who was still holed up in the police headquarters. When he arrived, he was instructed to wait for Ironsi in the anteroom to the office where Ironsi was. After waiting for about an hour, Victor Banjo began to suspect that something was not adding up. The previous day, he had had unfettered access to Ironsi. Now it appeared that he was unable to see his commander. Rather than jump to any conclusion, he still waited. Eventually, a few officers arrived to see Ironsi. Banjo knew these men, and he requested to join them to see Ironsi also. These men refused flatly. Banjo was now becoming a bit uncomfortable and even embarrassed. At some point, a number of expatriates also came to see Ironsi, but the Supreme Commander would still not see him. When it was clear that Ironsi was not going to see him, Banjo was about to get up and leave when Lieutenant Colonel G.T. Kurubu and Major P.A. Awuna approached him. At first, they were cordial and were asking to get more information from him on the latest situation in the country. Suddenly, the two men pulled out their weapons and informed Victor Banjo that he was under arrest. Banjo was about to resist them, but he was soon overpowered by a number of soldiers who had entered the room. It is believed that he would have been shot dead, but was very likely saved by the presence of a white man in the same room who had observed everything that happened. He was handcuffed and detained at Kirikiri Maximum Prison in Lagos. Those were very trying times in the Nigerian army, and it was difficult to tell who was doing what or who was not. Following Victor Banjo's arrest, Yakubu Gowon led a battalion of soldiers to his home at Ikoyi. When they arrived, there was no one in. Banjo's wife, Joyce Taiwo Banjo, had gone out to pick the children from school. The army had also withdrawn all the domestic staff at the house. Just as the soldiers were disembarking from their truck, Banjo's wife arrived at the house. She was shocked beyond measure to see gun-toting men all over her home. Her greatest fear was that some trigger-happy soldier would suddenly shoot at her and the children. Gowon reassured her that all was well and no one would be hurt. He had only come to the house to search for any incriminating evidence against her husband. She led him and the soldiers into the house and they began to comb the house. Banjo's wife kept her distance, ensuring that all the 4 children were safe. The oldest of them was 5 and the youngest was 6 months old. The soldiers did not find anything in Banjo's house, but they saw a shelf that was locked. Gowon requested the keys to the shelf, but Mrs. Banjo could not find it. Gowon then said that the shelf would have to be taken to them to Army headquarters. The shelf had a record of all vital documents regarding the Victor Banjo family, which will include children's birth certificate, marriage certificate, 2 life insurance policies, land papers for swaths of land in Ikeja, and a host of other vital documents. That shelf was never returned to the Victor Banjo family. On the 31st of May 1972, 2 years after the Civil War, Banjo's wife wrote Yakubu Gowon, who was head of state at the time, requesting those items taken away from her home, but she never got a reply. The Nigerian army still owes the Victor Banjo family an explanation regarding what happened to those documents. The Iranti government found itself in a quandary. On one hand, public opinion was heavily on the side of the coup plotters. The Balewa government had not been responsible in the way they were using the power that had been entrusted to them. Obafemi Awolowo, leader of the action group, and his men had been jailed in 1963 for an offense they clearly did not commit. The 1964 federal elections were a sham. There was practically no voting in northern Nigeria, yet people came into elected offices there. The worst part of it all was the obvious rigging of the 1965 regional elections that retained Ladoke Akintola in office. Western Nigeria was in crisis, and reports had it that the Balewa government had set up machinery to crack down on leaders of the opposition in the West, in the same way the Tiv riots had been set down in 1964. The Kaduna Nzeogo coup was an obvious corrective measure to put the country on a sound footing. The other challenge that faced Ironsi was that many people had been killed in the coup. Ironsi himself had been marked for elimination but escaped only by the whiskers. Before he was arrested, Victor Banjo had advised Ironsi that he should simply start things afresh. Banjo even requested that some of the mutinous soldiers should be included in the Ironsi government. Because public opinion was heavily on the side of the mutinous soldiers, Ironsi and his government could not execute them. Rather, they were put in jail. Victor Banjo himself was sent to Ikot Ikpene in present-day Akwa Ibom. He will remain in detention from January 1966 till March 1967. The record of Banjo's time in jail can be found in the book, A Gift of Sequence, Letters to My Wife. The book is written in Banjo's name but was put together by his third child, Professor Olayinka Omigbodun, and published in 2007. Banjo's stay in prison was simply a detention of some sort because he was never convicted by any court in the country. In fact, a police special branch that was set up by the Ironsi government, which interviewed all the coup plotters, revealed that Victor Banjo was not one of the organizers of the January 1966 coup. It is not clear why Ironsi continued to detain him. Around the time he arrived in jail, Banjo wrote Ironsi a letter protesting his continual detention. Ironsi replied him and said that he was being detained in faraway Ikot Ikpene because he had reports that some people were trying to kill him. Prison life was not easy for Banjo because there was simply no end in sight for it all. He did not know when he would be released. He, however, made the best use of his time in prison. Banjo wrote letters to his wife, children, family, and friends, updating them with regards to his well-being. He learned how to speak French and even German, and he became quite fluent in French, even writing letters to his wife in French. He took his time to explain his philosophy to life and why he could never be involved in a violent revolution, and he advised his wife on quite a number of things she must do if by chance he does not survive the upheaval the country was experiencing. On the 1st of June 1966, Victor Banjo wrote one final letter to Ironsi where he stated the following: "No one holds rank and authority in the army by divine right. The relationship of rank and authority in armies is based on law and a definite set of rules and regulations, which predetermines the rights and responsibilities of each rank. It is also based on the ageless tradition of honor, integrity, and loyalty, which is expected in reciprocal forms from all ranks. There is no provision in an organized state or in an organized army for a relaxation of these principles, for on it rests your command, your stability, and your safety, as otherwise there is little to prevent any two officers backed with weapons from arresting any of your officers tomorrow, even your military governors or even yourself. In this issue, I beg to submit that you can only have one clear duty: to protect the law, the traditions of the army, and the rights of every soldier and officer who has entrusted his life into your hands." Ironsi did not reply to this letter and did not heed the warnings that Banjo gave there. On the 29th of July 1966, Ironsi was arrested in Ibadan by junior soldiers with the same weapons Banjo had suggested in that letter. He and Adekunle Fajui were driven to the outskirts of Ibadan, beaten and then shot dead. The death of Ironsi was followed by riots in northern Nigeria, with an estimated 30,000 persons of Eastern extraction murdered. No less than 100 Igbo officers were also killed in the pogrom that followed. The country was tottering towards civil war. Yakubu Gowon was installed as the head of the Nigerian state. Colonel Emeka Ojukwu, who was the military governor of the eastern state, did not accept his authority. Gowon himself made it clear that he was finding it difficult to keep the country united. A meeting of senior military governors was held in Aburi, Ghana on the 4th and 5th of January 1967, where the continued unity of the country was discussed. Gowon and Colonel Ojukwu attended the meeting along with all the military governors of the three other regions. Gowon had released Obafemi Awolowo from prison in September 1966, 2 days after he had come to power. He then invited Awolowo into his government in June 1967. Gowon also divided the monolithic North into 6 states on the 27th of May 1967. He divided the East into 3 states, while the West retained its previous 3 states. Colonel Emeka Ojukwu declared secession from the Nigerian Federation on the 30th of May 1967. The following day, Gowon commenced police action against Ojukwu to bring an end to the rebellion of Eastern Nigeria. One of the decisions that followed the Aburi conference was that soldiers that were detained following the January 1966 coup should be released, since the soldiers who carried out the July 29, 1966 counter-coup were never prosecuted. Therefore, in March 1967, Colonel Ojukwu released Victor Banjo and all the soldiers detained in the eastern parts of Nigeria for their parts in the January coup. Victor Banjo did not have a home in eastern Nigeria, so Ojukwu invited him to live in the government house at Enugu with him. The horse trading between Ojukwu and Gowon was still ongoing, and it was obvious to everyone that the country was headed to civil war. That same month, Banjo's wife and children visited him at Enugu. It was a blissful reunion for all of them. Dele Banjo remembers that he had whitlow in one of his fingers, and his father clinically dissected it and treated it for him. Banjo told his wife that she and the children must leave Nigeria. She wanted him to come along with them. He explained that he would prefer to, but Nigeria needed him. Besides, Ojukwu, his good friend, needed his help, and he could not abandon him at that time. Taiwo Banjo could not understand it. She pleaded with her husband, weeping, but Banjo would not budge. Eventually, they had to part ways and flew back to Lagos as they prepared to leave Nigeria for Sierra Leone to live with her family over there. On the 6th and 7th of May 1967, Obafemi Awolowo led a delegation of 4 men to eastern Nigeria to see Colonel Emeka Ojukwu over the crisis in Nigeria then. In that meeting, the question of Yoruba land not having sufficient military officers to offer the kind of security the West would need to stand up to the North came up. Ojukwu explained that he had actually requested that Colonel Victor Banjo be at that meeting so that Awolowo could understand that it was not as if the West did not have military officers at all. Banjo is a very senior military officer in the Nigerian army, and he possesses great knowledge and experience, Ojukwu said. Awolowo replied that it would not be easy to have Banjo back in the West just like that, because he would have to work with the northern soldiers there. And many of those soldiers were still hurting from the death of Mimilari and others. Awolowo made it clear that Banjo's life would be in danger. So, as much as Banjo would have loved to return to Lagos and serve in the Nigerian army, the stigma that he was one of the coupists was still on him, in spite of a clear police report that vindicated him way back in 1966 during Ironsi's regime. In July 1966, Wole Soyinka visited eastern Nigeria to speak to Ojukwu. Soyinka was championing a third force, where Nigeria was the first force, Biafra the second force, and a group of men who were looking for a means to prevent a civil war in the country were the third force. After discussing with Ojukwu, Wole Soyinka then spoke to Victor Banjo. He saw that Banjo was quite open to his ideas, and that Banjo was already working on the idea of bringing a military force into southwest Nigeria to drive out northern soldiers who were there. Banjo even gave Soyinka a message to be delivered to Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo. Obasanjo, as of that time, was the head of the military garrison in Ibadan, and Banjo requested that Obasanjo simply stand down as he led a force of liberators to Lagos. Soyinka eventually met up with Obasanjo in Ibadan and shared this idea with him. Obasanjo refused him flatly. While Gowon had declared police action against eastern Nigeria on 1st of June 1967, fighting did not commence until the first week of July. The Nigerian troops went through present-day Kogi State and emerged in Benue State. They then launched an attack on the northern flank of Biafra, very close to Nsukka. Biafra put up a good fight, but it was not enough. By the close of July, Biafra had already lost so many of its bravest and fiercest fighters to the unrelenting firepower of the Nigerian army. One night in late July, after Biafra had suffered a particularly harrowing defeat, Ojukwu invited Victor Banjo along with a few other officers to visit the Nsukka sector. The morale of the fighting men was low, and it appeared that Gowon's boast to finish up the police action in a month was about to materialize. After speaking to the men, Ojukwu then spoke to Banjo and he requested that he helped in the fighting effort. Besides the loss of men and materials, Ojukwu suspected that some officers in the Biafran army were sabotaging the war effort. In fact, that same week, Ojukwu had only narrowly survived being voted out of office by officers in his own cabinet. Banjo gave the matter a lot of thought and resolved to join the Biafran army. Victor Banjo coordinated the fighting efforts in the northern flank of Biafra and also directed fighting that was opening up in the Ogoja sector of the war. He enjoyed some successes here, and then the idea of invading Lagos through the Midwest was born. Colonel Ojukwu and Brigadier Victor Banjo hatched this plot in utmost secrecy but with a lot of urgency. Because it was urgent, a lot of the details around the Midwest invasion were not properly spelled out, and this would eventually cause the failure of the whole expedition. On the 9th of August 1967, a little after midnight, a column of vehicles crossed the Niger Bridge from the Onitsha end of the bridge into Asaba. The invasion of the Midwest had begun. It was led by Brigadier Victor Banjo. There were 3 battalions of soldiers under him. A 4th battalion was formed under Major Adewale Ademoyega following his release from Warri prisons by Major Humphrey Chukwuka. There was practically no resistance to their movement. The 18th Battalion was sent to Warri. The 13th Battalion headed to Auchi to protect the northern flank of the Midwest from attacks by Nigerian forces. The 12th Battalion and the 19th Battalion were poised to seize Ibadan and Lagos after the invasion had been successful. The invasion of the Midwest redefined the whole war. David Ejo, military governor of the Midwest, had maintained a middle line between Gowon and Ojukwu. He had also requested that the Midwest should not be made into a theater of war. This was why Nigerian forces did not access Biafra through the Midwest. The ethnic politics of the Midwest had, however, made it impossible for the Midwest to be neutral to the war. The eastern parts of the Midwest had military officers who were working for Nigeria, but who had great sympathy for the Biafran cause. These men had been in touch with Ojukwu, and they were the ones who facilitated the ease with which the Midwest was taken over. Victor Banjo had won Ojukwu's trust to spearhead the invasion of the Midwest because of the way he had successfully handled the war effort in the Nsukka sector in the final weeks of July 1967. Ojukwu also believed that if pressure was exerted on Lagos, the bombardment of Biafra through the northern flank of its region would be reduced. But as Banjo entered the Midwest, a couple of negative signs began to play out before him. Ojukwu had told him that a number of Midwestern soldiers would meet up with him at the Asaba end and guide him to the government house to see David Ejo. When Banjo arrived, he did not see these men. He had to begin to work out alternative plans. The second thing was that Ojukwu had informed Banjo that Ejo was in the know of the whole invasion plan, that Banjo was to meet up with Ejo and discuss modalities of bringing the Midwest to cooperate with Biafra, while Banjo led the soldiers immediately to Ibadan. Banjo was still figuring out what to do with the officers who were absent at Asaba when he learned that the government house in Benin, where Ejo and his family were residing, had been attacked by Biafran soldiers. Banjo learned that Ojukwu had given orders that Ejo must be captured dead or alive. Banjo was very infuriated with this turn of events. While David Ejo and Victor Banjo were not particularly close in the Nigerian army, Ejo and Banjo had joined the army almost on the same day, and Banjo was not someone to throw away old comradeship. There was no way Victor Banjo will lead a column of soldiers whose supply line was in Enugu into Lagos while Benin was not properly secured in Biafran hands. Banjo's first instinct was to find Ejo and to convince him to join the Biafran cause. Ejo would remain the governor of the Midwest while Banjo could move into Lagos as planned. Victor Banjo reached the government house. The whole place was riddled with bullets. Banjo ensured that Ejo's wife and children were safe. Then he began to look for how to find Ejo. David Ejo had fled the government house the moment he had the opportunity to and was holed up within a friend's house in Benin. Eventually, word reached Victor Banjo that David Ejo would be willing to speak with him. but under the cover of the Roman Catholic Church. Banjo and Ejo met at midnight on the 12th of August 1967 to discuss the situation in the Midwest. Banjo was surprised to learn that Ejo was not in the know of the invasion. On his part, David Ejo made it clear that he did not trust Ojukwu and would not wish to be on his side in this conflict. Roman Catholic mission that hosted this meeting had requested that the two soldiers do not bring weapons to the meeting, and both of them honored this request. Years later, when Banjo's two daughters were heading to secondary school in Ibadan, the Roman Catholic Church gave the two girls special dispensations because they remembered the gentlemanly manner Banjo had handled the meeting that night in Benin. Banjo eventually reached Ojukwu on the phone and made his displeasure known to him. If he was going to succeed in this mission, he would need Ojukwu to be completely honest with him. Banjo then suggested that an officer of Midwestern extraction should be made governor of the Midwest. Ojukwu disagreed on this matter. He wanted Major Okonkwo to be the governor of the Midwest. Banjo argued that the civil populace will regard an Igbo officer ruling them as a conquest of their region. Ojukwu did not agree with him. At this point, Banjo had to leave Benin and head back to Enugu to see Ojukwu. While the debate between these two men continued, Gowon and his men in Lagos were taken aback at the ease with which the Midwest fell to Biafran forces. Everyone was jittery. It is true that if Biafra had maintained the element of surprise and continued the march from Benin to Ibadan and then to Lagos, Biafra might have succeeded at taking over Lagos. The problem, however, was that Victor Banjo, the man at the helm of all of this, was beginning to discover new things about his friend Ojukwu, and he was beginning to have second thoughts about invading Yoruba land with Igbo troops. The Midwest was not supposed to be taken over. The plan was to secure a government loyal to Biafra there while they marched into Lagos. But even at that time, reports of Igbo soldiers molesting citizens of the Midwest was already reaching Victor Banjo. Banjo returned to Benin on the 14th of August 1967 and gave a broadcast to the Nigerian nation at 8 p.m. of that day. The BBC broadcasted this speech live. In the broadcast, Banjo made it clear that he was not involved in the January 1966 coup. He said that he had joined his colleagues to form a federal military government that sought to stabilize the country. He said that he was in the middle of doing this when he was arrested by some of his colleagues out of fear and suspicion. He then explained that at the moment, the Nigerian nation is in the grip of a feudal knot, the same set of people who had plunged the country in the crisis in the first place. He told the nation that he did not believe that Nigeria should break up. At the same time, he believed that Biafra had a right to fight for its own self-existence after it had been pushed to the wall. He concluded his speech by stating that he was leading a liberation army into Western Nigeria, not a Biafran army. He said his topmost task at the moment was to stabilize the Midwest, after which he hoped to liberate Western Nigeria in the same manner he had liberated the Midwest. By a stroke of luck, Banjo's elder sister, Professor Mrs. Adeton Ogunsheye, happened to have listened to the live broadcast. She was still reeling from the effect of the broadcast when Victor Banjo put a call to her at her home in the University of Ibadan that same night. He told her that even though the authorities may have bugged her phone, he was sure they would not be able to hear what they were saying because he had placed a device on the call to scramble it to a third party. Banjo then asked his sister if the Yorubas were ready to receive him. She told him that most people in the Yoruba leaders of thought were sitting on the fence on the matter. The situation was made doubly difficult since Obafemi Awolowo had now joined the Gowon cabinet. Banjo explained that he needs only 50% grassroots support. He does not need the approval of the leaders. Madam Ogunsheye replied and said that the opinion of most leaders was that Banjo should simply move in. He does not need anyone's support. His support would rest on whether he succeeds or fails. Victor Banjo's philosophy of warfare and revolution was that he should have an initial large political base. It was the reason the planners of the January coup refused to involve him in the planning. Banjo believed that if more people were involved in a revolution, there would be less bloodshed. The problem, however, is that with more people involved in such a planning, the possibility of its leaking or failure increases. This is the reason why Victor Banjo stalled at Benin. He would not invade Ibadan and Lagos without some support from the Yorubas. Things got a lot worse for Banjo when Obafemi Awolowo responded to Banjo's broadcast by saying that anyone who knew the young man should tell him not to bring Igbo forces to Yoruba land. Emeka Ojukwu was very unhappy with the broadcast. He felt that rather than talking, Banjo ought to have been on the way to Lagos. He saw clearly that the element of surprise that Biafra had was already slipping away. 1 week after the invasion of the Midwest, the Nigerian army in Lagos was still not ready to repel the rebels. The only thing they could do at that time was to get civil engineers from the Ministry of Works in the Southwest to blow up bridges linking the West to the Midwest. The day following the broadcast, Banjo and his men were on their way to Lagos. But at this time, the Nigerian army had formed a formidable defense under the leadership of Murtala Muhammad. Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Muhammad formed the 2nd Division of the Nigerian Army with the express aim of flushing out the rebels from Benin. The Biafran army reached Ore, but they were repelled by the Nigerian army. Ojukwu recalled Victor Banjo back to Enugu. Ojukwu was unhappy with the state of the situation in the Midwest. When it was clear that he and Banjo could not agree on the way forward, he relieved Banjo of the command of the Midwest. Banjo had moved out of the government house in Enugu when Ojukwu announced the secession of Biafra from Nigeria. He was now staying in a house belonging to the ECN, where his brother used to be a manager. Banjo returned to the house and spent most of his day doing nothing. During this period, a group of young men had formed themselves into something of an intellectual think tank for Emeka Ojukwu. They will usually analyze the situation of the war and advise Ojukwu. The Biafran leader actually encouraged these activities. These men were Douglas Ngube, Sam Agbam, Bernard Odogu, Uche Chukwumerije, Christopher David Oswagu, Emmanuel Efejona, and Philip Alale. The period was late August 1967, and the war had opened up on 2 flanks, the northern flank from Nsukka and the western flank from Onitsha. Biafra was failing terribly on the 2 flanks, and it was obvious that defeat was inevitable. Ojukwu had also been unable to supply the fighting men with the kind of weapons they needed to ward off the Nigerian army. On the flip side, Nigeria had received incredible support from both Britain and even Russia, to the extent that the initial air supremacy that Biafra started the war with had been overtaken by more sophisticated planes that the Nigerian Air Force had acquired. This had grounded all the planes that Biafra had. These men decided to approach Ojukwu and tell him to surrender to Nigeria. To build support for their position, they approached Victor Banjo with the idea. They held a number of meetings over the matter, and one of such meetings took place in Banjo's house, there in Enugu. When they had reached a consensus on the matter, they drafted a memorandum and submitted it to Ojukwu's office. Nobody signed the document. At about the same time, Ojukwu and Banjo had settled their quarrel, and Ojukwu had prevailed on Banjo to return to Benin to see what he could salvage of the situation there. Banjo returned and managed to move the headquarters of the Biafran army from Benin to Agbo. At this time, the Nigerian army had retaken Benin City and was in hot pursuit of the Biafran soldiers. The situation was bleak, and by the 20th of September 1967, Biafra had withdrawn completely from the Midwest. They, however, ensured that they blew up the Niger Bridge, making it difficult for the Nigerian troops to enter Onitsha. Victor Banjo returned to Enugu on the 18th of September. The following day, he was arrested and charged with planning to overthrow the government of Biafra. A court was set up that was headed by Justice G.C. Ikemena. Victor Banjo, Ifeanyi Efejona, Philip Alale, and Samuel Agbam were accused by the state of Biafra for seeking to violently overthrow the fledgling nation. The 4 pleaded not guilty to the charges. 6 witnesses were brought against the accused. The four accused cross-examined all 6 witnesses over a 2-day period during which the trial took place. The testimony of Brigadier Alexander Madebo was probably the most damning. He said that the group had sent Philip Alale to him to ask him to join them and to relay a very important message they had to Ojukwu. Madebo learnt that they had wished that Ojukwu would surrender to the Nigerian army and at the same time resign from his office. Madebo also mentioned that when he asked how they planned to do this if Ojukwu refused, Alale had mentioned that he could be forced to. The nature of the force they planned to employ was not clear. Victor Banjo was given the opportunity to give the closing argument for the 4 accused. He made it clear that while indeed they had held meetings and discussed the state of the war, there was nothing in all their talk or in the memorandum that suggested a violent overthrow of the Biafran government. He explained that all 4 of them had given of their best to help the fighting efforts of Biafra. He told his listeners that he was actually supposed to be out of Nigeria at that time, but he remained behind to help Ojukwu, whom he considered was a friend of his. Banjo finished his defense with this statement: "On the whole, I had in private told Colonel Ojukwu that I could never be made to stand charge for having plotted against his office and his person. There was no plot against him." The following day, the 22nd of September 1967, the tribunal sat to pass judgment on the accused. Victor Banjo, Ifeanyi Efejuna, Samuel Agban, and Philip Alale were found guilty and sentenced to death. 2 days after, the 24th of September 1967, a massive crowd of Enugu residents gathered at the Enugu Biafran Army headquarters to witness their public execution. The word that had gotten around was that these 4 men had sold the Biafran cause to the Nigerian side, and this was the reason for the losses Biafra was suffering at that time, particularly in the Benin sector of the war. The crowd were braying for their blood. Victor Banjo was a picture of bravery to the end. While Ifejuna, Agbam, and Alale had relinquished themselves to death and were even still shouting out their innocence at the point of execution, Banjo faced his executors sternly. After the first volley of shot hit the 4 men, all 3 were already dead. Victor Banjo raised his head and called out, "I am not dead yet." The executioner called for a second round of shooting. He took a 3rd round of shooting to silence him finally. While many had come to witness the execution of the 4 saboteurs to the Biafran cause, Banjo's defiance, even at death, made a lot of people in the crowd that they began considering perhaps the man was innocent after all. For weeks after Victor Banjo's execution, his family were not sure whether he was dead or still alive because of the conflicting reports that kept emerging from Biafra. The Biafran propaganda machinery did report that some saboteurs had been killed, but the Nigerian army did not take this as fact. Till this day, the record on Victor Banjo in the army refers to him as being missing in action. His mother refused to accept the fact of his death, and the family, in deference to her, never mourned his passing publicly. His father did not handle his death well. J.H. Banjo's health degenerated rapidly and he died in 1969, 2 years after Victor Banjo's death. Banjo's wife and children were the most affected. Victor Banjo had told his wife that if anything were to happen to him at the war front, he would look for a way to inform her. In the final weeks of September 1967, Joyce Taiwo Banjo had a dream in faraway Sierra Leone where she had relocated. In the dream, she saw Banjo enter a plane with a male neighbor of theirs in Lagos. The plane flew into the sky and then vanished. She interpreted the dream as meaning all was well with her husband. That same week, she received a letter from Dr. Adesegun Banjo, Victor Banjo's younger brother, who told her that her husband had been killed. Joyce gathered the children and told them that their father had gone to see Jesus. The children, who were between the ages of 7 and 2 years old, stood up and rejoiced. From their limited perspective and understanding from church teachings, anyone who had gone to see Jesus had actually gone to a good place. They left their mother and returned to playing. The untimely passing of Victor Banjo at the age of 37 has, however, remained a major campaign for the family as they seek to bring justice to what they regard as the unfortunate murder of a son of the Yorubas. Banjo's elder sister, Professor Adeton Ogunsheye, published a book titled A Break in Silence in 2001, where she documented the life of her brother and wrote of all the events around his killing. Banjo's third child, Professor Olayinka Omigbodun, a child psychiatrist with the University of Ibadan, also published A Gift of Sequence in 2007, in which she documented Banjo's letters to his wife while he was in prison. The events around Banjo's trial and killing in Biafra were documented by Nelson Otter in his book Rebels Against Rebels, which was published in 1981. Quite a number of other books have been written on Banjo, including Text and Publishing's account of him, which is titled Victor Banjo, which was published in 2018. 2 days after Banjo and 3 others were executed, Nigerian soldiers entered Enugu. Ojukwu had withdrawn from the city and was holed up in a town in present-day Abia State. The overall perception of people 58 years after his death was that Victor Banjo and the men who were trying to convince Ojukwu to surrender to the Nigerian side as of September 1967 were correct after all. All the initial impetus for the continuance of the war as of September 1967 had been lost. Many able, brave, and brilliant officers that Biafra had were already dead by that time in the war. Ojukwu had promised his fighting men weapons, but these weapons were not forthcoming. It was clear that he was simply leading his people on a suicide mission. That the war was not rounded up and finished by October 1967 is owing more to the incompetence of some of the officers leading the war efforts on the Nigerian side. Rather than going straight for the kill and arresting Ojukwu, it appeared that some soldiers on the Nigerian side spent most of their time carrying out vengeful reprisal on unarmed civilians around Biafra. This is what led to the astronomical rise in the loss of civilian lives, and this is what Banjo and those men saw when they counseled Ojukwu to surrender to Nigeria. Another factor was that Ojukwu had been prosecuting the war like a personal feud between himself and Gowon. Banjo had counseled to increase the decision-making base of Biafra's Council of War. Ojukwu had become a cult figure in Biafra, and it appeared that all that he was concerned with was sustaining this image before the Biafran people. A lot of the leading political figures in Biafra in those days were not involved in his decision-making, and this included Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe. His strong insistence on the war to continue only resulted in needless loss of lives. Proof of all this is in the fact that the moment Ojukwu fled Nigeria in January 1970, the war was brought to an end. Since the end of the Biafran War, there have been no end to secessionist groups emerging within Nigeria calling for an independent state of Biafra. The loudest of these groups have been the indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB. These people have, in some cases, taken up arms against the Nigerian state, even killing members of the public in the southwest state that used to make up Biafra. Nnamdi Kanu, their leading spokesman, had been prosecuted and jailed by the Nigerian government. The false narrative that sustained the war in the first place is still being propagated among the Igbos till today. The sad reality about wars is that it takes from the land the best of its mind. Igbo land is not the only part of Nigeria that suffered losses during the war. The Yorubas also suffered great losses. Rather than begin insurgencies around the country, the Yorubas count their losses, learn from their mistakes, and ensure that those mistakes are not repeated. Victor Banjo's mistake was that he was too trusting of people. He felt that everyone had the right kind of motive that he had for the country. This is why, when the January 1966 coup occurred, many of his colleagues were less forward with their personal opinions. They chose rather to wait and see how things will pan out. On the other hand, Banjo threw himself into the situation and sought to save the day. His actions were misinterpreted and he was arrested and detained. In the East, Banjo should have known that friendship is a subjective thing. A man may be your friend today and turn into your worst enemy tomorrow. Banjo remained in Nigeria between the months of March and July 1967 only because of his friendship with Emeka Ojukwu. When Ojukwu had lost so many of his finest officers, Banjo had to step in to help his friend. His reward for his faithful service to Biafra was his eventual execution. Today, Victor Banjo's body lies buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Enugu. There is no official record of his death. Some members of his family have not even reached for closure. Some of them are still hoping he could return from the war front one day. The Nigerian government should consider honoring this able son of the Yorubas. Banjo's speech in Benin revealed that his foray into the Nigerian Civil War was to forestall the disintegration of Nigeria. He was a third force that was fighting for the unity of the country. Banjo had the option of moving Biafran troops into Ibadan and Lagos in late August 1967, but his personal aversion to unnecessary shedding of blood dissuaded him. His position was that even if 50% of the Yoruba nation will receive him, he could then roll into the West with little or no resistance. Banjo knew that this would be at variance with the plans of Emeka Ojukwu, but he was ready to lay down his life rather than turn the Southwest into a theater of war. Sometimes in June 1967, Banjo had written to one of his siblings and told this person that he was not sure he would survive the war. He was, however, going to give the situation his best. Victor Banjo was an officer of the Nigerian Army who had been trained in some of the best military academies in the world. He was the first Nigerian officer to be sponsored by this country to acquire a university degree. He was just about settling down into the electrical and mechanical corps of the Nigerian Army, where he hoped to help build homemade military equipment for the country when the January 1966 coup occurred. Victor Banjo held the position that Nigeria had given him so much and was not going to abandon the country at her greatest hour of need. He practically gave his life for the unity of Nigeria. What do you think about Victor Banjo? Was he a saboteur to the Biafran cause? Or was he a great Nigerian patriot who laid down his life for the unity of this country? Let us know what you think in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.